not sure.
Welcome to Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Ambassador Ray Burghardt. The ambassador has been on the show several times, and most of the time he comes here, in fact, every other time, it has been to talk about Taiwan, since he is indeed the chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan. But he also has another area of expertise, and that is dealing with Vietnamese issues. Interestingly enough, his tour and his career in the Foreign Service started, first tour in Vietnam, and his last one was as ambassador to Vietnam. So his career kind of bookended with Vietnam. What we want to focus on today is Vietnam 40 years after the fall of the Saigon government. And you probably have, been listening to the news and know that last Thursday, April 30th, marked the 40th year since the collapse of the Saigon government. I'd like to welcome you back to Asia in Review. It's great to have you again.
Great to be here. Great to talk about Vietnam. I was just there about 3 days ago.
Wow.
Just on a trip there for a week and just got back. So I'm feeling sort of up to date a little bit.
Great. Well, let's go back then first, if you don't mind. And okay, your first tour in the State Department was in Vietnam.
It was, yes.
And tell us about that. What were some of your first impressions of Vietnam? Did you know anything about it before you got there, or did the State Department just kind of plop you down
the State
there?
Department, it was my first assignment, and all of the new officers those days were being sent to Vietnam. It was during the war. Mm-hmm. I joined the Foreign Service in 1969. And all the people in my Foreign Service class were sent, almost all, were sent to Vietnam. And we were...
So it wasn't by choice?
Wasn't by choice. We were drafted. And we were loaned to the Agency for International Development for a year and a half or 2-year assignment to work in one of the provincial advisory teams in the countryside. It was not a normal diplomatic assignment. And, but they did a good job of training us those days. Frankly, a lot better job than we're using now to train people to go to Iraq or Afghanistan for similar kind of assignments. We spent almost an entire year studying Vietnamese and studying Vietnamese culture and history. They also took us down to Fort Bragg to learn how to fire M16s and RPGs and how to defend ourselves if necessary. I think the language study was a little more intensive than the RPG training, but still, although firing an RPG is interesting. So, but as you know, I suppose,
right.
But as an old Army guy, but we were, you're never perfectly prepared, but they did a pretty good job actually, and a pretty effective job. And so I arrived there October 5th, 1970. In the end, I only spent about 7 months on one of the provincial advisory teams. And then they pulled me into the embassy to be a political officer in the embassy.
Wow.
And I spent the next 2 years, I spent 2.5 years there.
Well, let me see. Could we get that map of Vietnam up on the screen? Oh, there we go. So we'll help to focus the, the audience. And we can see Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon.
Actually, everybody there still calls it Saigon.
Everybody still calls it Saigon, except the government in the north.
Well, technically they're not even the same thing. It's a long story. Saigon is a city. It's Ho Chi Minh City combined Saigon and the province around it. So,
okay. So now, when you were in the countryside, whereabouts were you?
Well, in that assignment, actually, I was just in the province that surrounded Saigon. But while I was in the advisory team for Nha Dinh province, which surrounded Saigon. Okay. So I wasn't too far out in the countryside. However, later when I got into the embassy, my job was to follow all of the religious groups in the country, which in many ways functioned like political parties. They were the civil society. Most of them, particularly the Catholics and the indigenous religious groups, the Cao Dai and the Hoa Hao, were very anti-communist. And so I got to know them very well. And I spent a lot of time in the countryside, sometimes weeks at a time, working with them. And particularly in the Tay Ninh area, up near the Cambodian border.
That's the heart of the Cao Dai.
Yeah, right.
Kuliana.
Right, yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the cow diet because they seem to be very difficult for any government to deal with. As I recall, they were difficult for the Republic of Vietnam. I hear they
Yeah, they're
difficult for the current
they're kind of
government.
classic fence straddlers, you know. So, well, I went back there 28 years later as ambassador, and I found that the cow dye had split, and some of them were pro-government, and some of them were anti-government, and the pro-government people were a little bit wary, and the anti-government people greeted me in 2001 with open arms. So,
Well, how did you deal with them? Because I mean, a lot of people were very challenged by the cow dye. What kind of issues did you deal with them? You're sort of winning their hearts and minds for the Republic of Vietnam?
No. I was really a reporting job, trying to understand where they were. And the thing that made, I guess, the most difficult thing was we found that the provincial governor there, the military guy who'd been appointed by the South Vietnamese government as the governor, we found out he was pretty corrupt, which was frankly not unusual. And we found out that
I wanted to get into that.
we found out that he was paying off he was sometimes providing arms and money to the VC who were in the hills just not too far away. So so that was a little bit sensitive. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, now, before that, before you got pulled into the embassy and you were working in monitoring religious affairs, you were working in the countryside, although not that far from Saigon. What kind of things were you doing there? Were you doing like economic development, political development?
A lot of the work a lot of the people I was working with were doing economic development and were doing also working on military issues. I was specifically working on helping in refugee camps. I was doing work to make sure supplies came in and that they were being well administered. The government in Cambodia, not a very good government, Long Nol government, had driven out the ethnic Vietnamese population. And they had fled, just before I got there, they'd fled to Vietnam. And so they were in a lot of refugee camps, and we were we were helping the Vietnamese government to take care of them. That's one of them. I mean, I did that for a few months. That was the main thing I was doing. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Now, I also remember you telling me one time that en route to Vietnam, you stopped in Taiwan.
I did, yes.
And that was for some sort of training?
The Taiwan government had been very effective at having sort of village development and development of land reform work and things like that. And so they had offered to provide training for people going to work in the provinces in Vietnam. So we did that. It was just a few days, yeah.
Yeah, I've always felt the land reform in Taiwan was highly successful, but it always on the same, on the other side of the coin, I always felt land reform in Vietnam was pretty much of a failure.
Yeah, they didn't do as good a job, no. Yes.
And I remember sitting in Vietnam trying to figure out the war in the Army, as you mentioned, and figuring, if we're doing the right thing, why does it seem the bad guys are winning? And it sort of came down to the fact it's largely about land reform.
Well, I don't know. There are a lot of reasons. Frankly, you were there in an earlier period.
I was there 68 to 70.
And that was a very rough period. Very rough period. The Tet Offensive,
right.
other attacks. The period I was there from late October 1970 until middle of '73 was interestingly actually relatively stable period. The pacification, the strength of the South Vietnamese government was actually pretty good. We could drive all over the place. There were areas when roads we knew to avoid, but the amount of mobility we had, the amount of security we had was frankly infinitely greater than during the period you were there, and also a lot greater than our people working today in Iraq and Afghanistan have. Real irony. I think, so what went wrong? I think a couple of things went wrong. First of all, I think the government in the South really was quite a weak government, which once we were no longer there, once we'd pulled out our troops completely by 73. April 73, January through April 73, we pulled out the rest of the truth. It really didn't connect with the people very well. It didn't have a lot of, there was no base. That was a real problem. The Viet Cong, the communists, they were well organized. They had a fanatical base.
I agree.
They actually lost a lot of battles. I mean, the South and the U.S. won a lot.
Right.
Even the Tet Offensive was a military fiasco for the communists.
That's true.
They had another big offensive in 72 while I was there. They didn't really win that either. The communists didn't really, they lost a lot of people. But then after we had departed completely, the government did not take that period, not take that opportunity to strengthen its popular support. It really didn't know how. And then I have to say also, when the big offensive came in the spring of 1975, and it was not a guerrilla offensive, it was a main force offensive of the North Vietnamese military force. As you may remember, we didn't come to help our friends.
Right.
We did not, the Congress was not going to give any support, even in terms of replacement weapons and equipment was not forthcoming from the administration because the Congress wasn't going to fund it, and we didn't provide any kind of air support or anything else. We were out of it. And so the South Vietnamese army just collapsed pretty much like a house of cards. So I think you'd have to add a third factor, I think, with just really bad military leadership. And really bad leadership on the top of the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese. I mean, President Thieu decided to pull out in the north, in the Da Nang Hue area,
strategic withdrawal
without really much of a fight.
Yeah.
Then they started to pull out in the Central Highlands, and I think, you know, a more gifted military commander would not have done that, and so that was a fiasco also. So I mean, it's not one reason, but it's those three reasons and maybe a few others also.
Let's take a break here. You're watching Asia in Review. My guest today is Ambassador Ray Burghardt, formerly a U.S. ambassador to Vietnam. Last week marked the 40th year since the government of Saigon, the Saigon government, capitulated. And we're looking back on the Vietnam War, trying to draw some lessons from that. We'll be right back.
Hi, Jay. My name's Keith Bettinger.
I knew that.
And I'm the host of ThinkTech Asia.
I knew that too.
Here on ThinkTech.
Fabulous. You got a great show going, Keith.
Thank you very much. And for our viewers out there that are interested in ThinkTech Asia, it airs every Tuesday from 4 to 4:45. And it can be accessed online at thinktech.com.
Yeah, so what kind of guests you like?
Well, we have a number of guests from academia, from practitioners of international affairs. Sometimes we have military officials. Sometimes we have public officials on the show. And our goal, we try to talk about current issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia, all throughout the Asian realm, in more depth than you would find in traditional mainstream
That's
media.
the difference, isn't it?
Exactly.
That you're reaching out beyond what ordinary news media would do.
Right.
That's why we like you so much.
We're trying to provide a thinking person's perspective, an intelligent perspective on what's going on, and we're both sides of the story, or even when there's more than two sides, we try to cover every angle. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we provide here at ThinkTech, is it's a really innovative source of educational programming for the people of Hawaii.
You're great, Keith. You are a great host. You got a great show going on. I watch it every week.
Thanks very much.
Why don't you guys watch it every week too, okay?
4:45 to 4 to 4:45 every Tuesday.
Welcome back to Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Ambassador Ray Burghardt. We've been talking about Vietnam. Before we move on to the present day, what kind of lessons do you think the U.S. learned from Vietnam?
Different people in the United States learn different lessons, depending on what the lessons they wanted to learn from it.
Okay.
I would say, I would point toward a few things.
Okay.
I would say one is, you better be sure that the government you're defending has a pretty solid political base and is doing the right things to solidify it. Particularly if it's fighting against an enemy which does have some kind of fanatical base among part of the population.
Right.
So you better be sure about that. And I guess the other thing is you really need a pretty clear definition at home here in the United States as to what our goals are. And if we ever can get it, it'd be also very nice to have unity of view between the executive branch and the legislature and the Congress, or else you end up in a situation in which, like we had in Vietnam in 1975, where the Congress says no, and the president wants to do something.
Let's move on to the present day. Now the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. is reasonably friendly. But is it really stoical? I mean, have the Vietnamese really forgotten about the war? You get this image of, say, well, they've all put that kind of in the past. They don't think about that anymore. Was that your experience as ambassador? Or did little things pop up?
I've been there, you know, I think it's remarkable how much they put the war behind them. Very pragmatic people. We always knew that. And they really showed that in the way they dealt with the memory of the war. Of course, there is bitterness still in some quarters. You still find it in, you know, it's still a one-party communist Leninist state. You find it among some of the hardliners in the military, in the intelligence force, propaganda department of the party. You find it there. It exists. And it results in some difference of opinion within the Politburo sometimes as to how much they want to advance with us. But overall, it's remarkable how pragmatic the Vietnamese have been and their willingness to move forward with the relationship. I think there's several reasons for that. Part of it is just the character of the Vietnamese people is very pragmatic, very focused on today and the future, not inclined to dwell on the past. Very different than some of the tensions in Northeast Asia, where you know, the Koreans, for example, never want to forget the Second World War.
Sure.
I think the other thing is the Vietnamese government feels that it won the war, so they feel that therefore no need to be so bitter. We won. That's part
an interesting
That's
view.
part of the attitude.
That's good.
Definitely part of the attitude. I will tell you a story. In 3 years as ambassador there, I only had 2 incidents in which bitterness was really openly expressed to me, and they came from opposite directions. The first one I'll mention was the more familiar, the one that people would expect more. I was with Admiral Denny Blair, then the commander of the Pacific Force, the Pacific commander, and we were visiting along the northern coast. We were visiting a site where one of our teams was excavating to bring up a plane that had been crashed by an American pilot. And as we approached the village, a couple of old guys started muttering to themselves, and they looked at us, and they were, I understand Vietnamese, so unfortunately I had to interpret for the Admiral that he said, that doesn't look too good. I said, it's not. I said, one of them said, the one guy on the left said to the other guy, haven't you killed enough people here? How dare you show your faces here?
Wow.
And then as we left, the same 2 old guys were there, and as we walked out, one of them said, if I were you, I wouldn't come back. Might not be safe next time. So that was bitterness. But it's, and as Admiral Blair said to me, well, who knows? Maybe we, you know, the guy who we're digging out bombed the village. Who knows? Maybe the guy's daughter died, or,
Yeah.
you know, who knows? You know, and so, but what's striking really was how exceptional it was, how unusual it was in years of being there. The other incident came in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City. I was at a reception and somebody came up to me and claimed he had known me during the war, and a lot of people would say that.
A Vietnamese.
Vietnamese, most of the time it wasn't true, but anyway, this guy came up and then he got very close and he said, "You deserted us. You and your country deserted us. And you left us to this disaster," actually use another word, but anyway, this disaster that
One we probably can't say on the air.
that we have to live with every day. And then he just turned on his heel and walked away. And so he was bitter. He was bitter because he had obviously sympathized with the other side, with the South.
Right.
Very unusual, because most of those people, of course, are living in Orange County or Houston or Honolulu, you know, but there's still a lot of them, you know, there's still some people there.
Sure.
And actually, in some ways, I like that story, because when some of the leadership in Hanoi would sometimes talk to me how people were not bitter and they'd forgotten, I would tell them that story. Of course, they didn't like that story because they wanted to believe that nobody like that was still left in Vietnam, you know. So yeah, I mean, but just to tell you, I think 70% of the population of Vietnam today was born after the war ended in 1975.
It's a very young country.
Very young country, very young, very dynamic. People are very focused on, they like America. I mean, it's one of the great ironies is that probably the population in Vietnam is the most pro-American population in Southeast Asia. Who would have guessed that 40 years ago? I mean, it's extremely pro-American. I think part of it is we've done a great job of working together to overcome legacies of the war. Clearing mines, clearing ordnance, searching for remains of Americans. We're helping them search for the remains of their soldiers. We cleaning up Agent Orange hotspots,
Right.
Helping people who were in one way or another hurt during the war. A lot of help not only by the American government, but very much by private organizations, Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, on which I was on their board for a while. All kinds of peace trees, all kinds of great NGOs, much of which started even before we normalized in 1995. So you have all of that going on. That's helped a lot. And then I think there's another important reason, which is that in the last few years, the US and Vietnam have decided and very much acted on a sense that we have strategic convergence between us, meaning that the Vietnamese are very concerned about China, very concerned about China's aggressiveness in the region, and about its aggressiveness toward some of the islands out there that people can see on the map, which are to the east of Saigon. And the U.S., we of course have our own concerns about China's aggressiveness in Southeast Asia and in other parts of Asia. And so we and the Vietnamese have been drawn together by that in the last 10 years or so.
Interesting. You know, it's interesting. This is a little bit different than what you were just talking about, but just mention it for what it's worth. I've read about 3 novels that were originally written in Vietnamese, translated to English, and then snuck out of the country, written by Vietnamese veterans of the Vietnam War. These are guys that from the North who spent maybe 10 years in the South, went back to the North, victory, victory, you know, everything's going to be peaches and cream. And we're kind of disappointed.
Yeah.
I suppose you've probably read a few of those.
I've read some of those novels, and there's a very interesting, a couple of very interesting books actually, by people who fought in the South as part of the coalition with the Viet Cong, with the communists. but they themselves were not communist. And they unfortunately believed the myth that this was really a coalition of equals.
Right.
And when the government was formed in 1975, after the victory of the communists, these were people who were given some positions and then pretty quickly were shoved out of the way and realized that they'd made a big mistake and that this was going to be a communist government and it was going to be unified with the North, and that all of that nonsense about a national liberation front and about becoming a separate government in the South was
inspired
a big
by
lie.
ancient.
And so there's been very interesting books written by Trung Yu Tang, the fellow who was a general with our opponents in the South, and who ultimately became completely disillusioned and fled the country. And there's another one by a guy named Duan Van Thuy, who I had known as a radical student leader in Saigon, throwing fire bombs at the American embassy and so forth. And he also stayed behind and was happy about the victory of the communists in 1975, but ultimately he ended up in jail. So this is a guy who had the misfortune of having been jailed by the government in the South, and then after the government in the North won, he was jailed, and the country was unified. He was jailed again by the next government, by the victors. So now he lives in California.
One of those Orange County guys. We're going to take another break here. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Ambassador Ray Burghardt. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam. We're talking about Vietnam of today, and we'll be right back.
Inspired by an ancient culture. Classical Chinese. Vigorous physicality. Timeless stories. 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance. Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Welcome back to Asia in Review. My guest today is Ambassador Ray Burghardt. We're talking about Vietnam, today's Vietnam. Well, it's interesting your comment that in Southeast Asia, Vietnam is the most pro-American country. You see, I would have thought maybe it was Thailand, although Thailand I think has slipped in recent years, or maybe the Philippines. But when you said Vietnam, I have to admit I was a little bit set back.
Maybe a slight exaggeration, but yeah, the Philippines is pretty pro-American too. And I wasn't talking about the government. I was talking about the man in the street. Yeah. I mean, this is a country where you walk down the main street in Hanoi, as I did this week, but not this time, but 2 years ago when I walked down that street. There's a lot of big bookstores there. In one of the main bookstores, there was a huge promotion all about books about Bill Gates. And I talked to people about it, and young people and so forth. I said, this is what they want to be when they grow up.
Well, what about the economy? Now, Vietnam certainly wants to be in on TPP. is that a problem for him? I mean, is there, you know, protectionist walls
Yeah.
that need to be torn down?
Yeah.
Where's the?
The economy in Vietnam has grown very rapidly in the last 20 years. Part of the reason is they've opened up to trade with other countries. A lot of we have a bilateral trade agreement with Vietnam, which we signed in 2001, actually just before I got there in 2001. We have, after that, we signed a lot of follow-up agreements, agreement on air traffic, shipping agreement. You know, we now have ships and planes that fly to each other's countries, and we have many different kinds of economic agreements in Vietnam, textile agreement and so forth. So, and European Union, Japan, all those countries, China, they all have enormous increase in trade with Vietnam. Vietnam has a lot of, exports a lot of oil. There's a lot of oil in the South China Sea, and they ship oil out. They also have become a big producer of garments and textile goods, replacing actually a lot of the Chinese production because the Chinese have become too expensive.
Right.
And they're starting to move up the ladder of technology. There's a very large Intel factory, chip factory and testing facility in Vietnam, and so forth. So, and now companies, Samsung now also, the Koreans have really discovered Vietnam in the last 2 or 3 years.
Oh, wow.
So the Korean companies like Samsung, Hyundai are big in Vietnam. Samsung's making parts for their cell phones there and so forth. So per capita income's gone up. In the south, this is Saigon area, Ho Chi Minh City is actually a little wealthier, a little higher standard of living than Hanoi. It's a bigger city, more industrial, more business savvy. It's now in the 3,000 per year range per capita down in the south. So in the big cities. So the Vietnamese have asked to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. They are one of the 12 countries that are now negotiating. In many ways, I think the sort of key to the whole thing really is our negotiations with the Vietnamese and also with the Japanese, two very different economies.
Sure.
The Vietnamese are probably, as best as I can remember, I think the poorest economy per capita. That's among the 12. They're also the one with the most state-owned enterprise. And the TPP is intended to be pretty tough on state-owned enterprises, not allowing a lot of preference for state-run companies, and so that they can, not allowing them to crowd out private companies competing from the United States or other countries. But the negotiations in Vietnam have in general gone pretty well. Frankly, better than what people expected. And I was just talking to people about that in Vietnam this week, and the people in our embassy and our ambassador and others. And there are still some issues about labor relations. In Vietnam, there are no labor unions like we know of labor unions. The labor unions there are run by the state. People do not, don't sort of elect their own labor union leaders like they do in the United States, and or in most sort of free labor countries. In Vietnam, the unions. So therefore, some of the American unions, some of the people in our Congress have been somewhat skeptical about whether Vietnam will be able to live up to some of the labor expectations and demands of the TPP. But we're working on that. Our government and other countries negotiating with Vietnam, and they seem pretty optimistic at reaching agreement. So.
Just a political question. Within the Politburo of Vietnam, what sort of percentage of members sort of lean towards China, and as opposed to, say, like America or the greater world?
That's we don't get to take a poll there, you know?
As you read the tea
It's a
leaves.
little, that is really tea leaf reading, you know,
Okay.
like following China 30, 40 years ago. I would say that first of all, fear of China, concern about China, is something deeply ingrained in the Vietnamese character. They have been, in some way or another, they've had troubled relations with China for about 2,000 years. I'm not
note that-
exaggerating.
I note that every street in Vietnam is named after a hero
Right.
who
Every
successfully opposed the
statue in
Chinese.
Vietnam is to somebody who heroically fought against the Chinese at some point in the last 2,000 years. But there is the fact that the Vietnamese and Chinese communist parties are the two most important communist parties left in the world today. And they do have this sort of ideological brotherhood,
Right.
which still is a factor. And there are people in the party who are, and the other thing I would say is that there is suspicion of the United States within the party, particularly among some of the more hardline leaders, that we're going to try to do what they think we did in Poland or in the Ukraine, and we're going to use what they call peaceful evolution to try to undermine the party. That it's the same fear that we've seen the Chinese have, you know, in which they've sort of revived very strongly in China in the last last year under Xi Jinping, the new leader.
Right.
This fear that these concepts of Western democracy and a free press and competitive political system and free unions and free religion, all that is somehow going to undermine the authority of the party. And that there must be an American plot to try to do that and to change the system.
Very Chinese
And so the Chinese are very paranoid about that. The Vietnamese, I think, maybe not quite as paranoid about it, but there are people in the party who worry about that. And so I don't have any numbers, but there are some of them, and I know some of them. I would say that the prevailing view in the leadership today is to maintain good relations with the United States and to try to cooperate on as many things as possible and to keep down the level of worry about us. And there certainly is a lot of cooperation going on. We have American Navy ships visiting Vietnam twice a year. We have joint exercises. We have just lifted the ban on selling lethal weaponry to Vietnam. We're looking at, you know, the kinds of equipment that might make sense to sell them. We cooperate on a lot of things.
With their oil exploration in the South China Sea, they actually have the cash to pay for it too, don't they?
They're okay. Yeah, I mean they have some accumulation of foreign reserves. Yeah, I mean they're nowhere near as cash rich as China or Japan, but they're or even Taiwan, but they're okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Well,
They bought a lot of weapons from Russia in
Right. recent
years. A lot. Subs, jets, lots of pretty sophisticated weapons they bought from Russia in the last 20 years.
We're coming down to our last 2 minutes here. It seems that they also have a very burgeoning relationship with India.
They do. I'm not sure how far it'll go, but there is a tendency now in Asia for countries around the periphery of China, you know, neighbors of China, who for various reasons feel that the Chinese are bullying on them, to join together. Some tendency, you know.
Right.
And so Japan, Vietnam, India are certainly part of that pattern. Yeah. Also, the Indians themselves have made an effort to try to. India has been a sort of slow country in terms of developing trade relations over the last few decades. And particularly under Mr. Modi, the new prime minister, they're trying to catch up. It started a little bit under the previous prime minister in India too.
Right.
So they have been working hard to develop more trade, better relations with Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your views on Vietnam, the Vietnam of then and to the Vietnam of today. It sounds like Vietnam is really getting its act together and moving right along. And want to thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week at the same time.